Hello and welcome to the Sales Leaders series. I'm your host, Freddie, where I'll be gathering B2B SaaS sales leaders from across the world to answer 5 short, topical B2B SaaS sales questions. These questions are going to be the same each week, bar one, giving you insight and different perspectives into how top performers within the industry think, as well as actionable advice you guys can use in your own selling careers. Our guest this week is David Meyer. David is the co-founder of Clarify, an organization helping global tech companies around the world create sustainable revenue with sales, marketing, and talent consulting services. With over 20 years of experience in the software technology space, David has a rich understanding of B2B selling and leading sales teams from mid-market to enterprise. Since starting Clarify, the team has grown from 6 people just under 200 employees, working with high-value technology clients worldwide. David is also a proud trustee of the Clarify Foundation, a foundation aimed at directly supporting underserved communities. To date, the foundation has helped raise $150,000 to improve education provision across 10 primary schools in Uganda. David, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Very good, thank you, Freddie. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to have you on. The way this is going to work is I'm going to ask you 4 similar questions like we do with all of our sales leaders. And then we've got a variable question at the end given to us by our previous guest. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Fantastic. So we'll just jump straight into this. First question, when thinking about how you've grown revenue over those 20 years, especially starting at Clarify and building that company, is there one thing or maybe a combination of ways of thinking or frameworks that you've found made the difference to you and your teams in being able to grow that revenue?
Yeah, I had to think about it a little bit as to how did I pick through the thousands of things that I felt are important. But I think that the kind of guiding principle that we've applied for ourselves and that we've applied with our customers that's differentiated has been to focus on looking at the problem from the customer's perspective or the prospect's perspective rather than our own. So it's really easy to fall into the trap of trying to focus on what do we do, how can we help them be better or whatever it might be, when in reality they don't care to a large extent about you and about what you're going to do. It's more about their world. And so understanding the context that surrounds the industry that they're in, the subsegment of that industry that they're focused on, the specific role that you're trying to address and the kinds of challenges they're likely to be facing allows you to come up with some kind of hypothetical kind of scenarios that you can play with in that scenario. And people generally are really good about that. They'll correct you if you're slightly wrong, or they'll just slap you down if you're completely wrong, but at least you've made the effort, right? You've differentiated not just in what you do, but in how you go about selling and engaging. So I think there's a lot that goes into actually making that happen. But I think that principle of putting their perspective first is probably the most important.
And over those 20 years, I guess, is that something that you've noticed proliferate? I guess the focus on understanding the customer side of things rather than what you're doing. Is that something that's sort of gradual? You've seen increase in general in the market, or just as your journey internally as growing Clarify?
I think it's fundamental to what we do and how we do it. So we see it all the time. I think if I was to look outside of our business and where are other people applying those principles, I'd say it's patchy in terms of adoption of that principle. I think where a lot of people have gone to is, if you like, a similar principle, which is personalization. It's subtly, not so subtly different in a principle sense, but people conflate the two. They go, well, the context and the personalization. So knowing that you're Freddie Johnson and that your role is X and you work for Y, that's personalized, but it's not necessarily contextual to the situation that you're in and what's going on and the degree to which you can push that. So I think there's a lot of scope for improvement in just how do you make that more effective, more impactful for end customers and prospects.
Makes sense. Question 2. What is the biggest challenge your selling teams are currently facing right now? And how are you and the team trying to tackle it, especially obviously looking forward to 2023?
So I'd be amazed if you don't get a very similar set of answers to this question over the next little while. Um, just the kind of macroeconomics are tightening up, and that immediately has an effect on every technology business, SaaS business, because the drivers all change at that level. They start to shift away from growth at all costs into a more kind of efficiency orientated set of process. And so we're seeing that in our customers, in the way that they're operating, and obviously it has to translate into what we do as well. So our messaging has had to shift to being more efficiency orientated, productivity orientated, and that's true for a lot of our customers as well. They're having to emphasize those factors much more, and some of the capabilities that we're taking to market are fundamentally different. We're going to kind of focus more on outsourcing, which is a capability that we have, because that's all about reducing risk and kind of taking problems off people's balance sheets and so on. And I expect everybody's going to have to think about, and obviously that's very dependent to the type of solution that you have and the type of audience you're selling to, but you're going to have to get very cost focused, very return on investment focused over the next, well, we don't know how long it's going to last, but the transition needs to have happened already or is happening right now.
That makes sense. I guess over those the 19 years that you started to Clarify, I can imagine, especially over like 2008, 2009, have you seen similar sorts of changes within Clarify and how you've had to adapt to those sorts of changing macroeconomic environments to make sure that you do adapt? Are there any advice you would give to other people going to do that for the first time?
Yeah, so I think we have. I mean, we were kind of born into that climate, if you like. My career started in 2000, which was basically when the dot-com bubble burst and everything had to change, if you like, for the first time, as far as I was concerned.
Right.
And Clarify was kind of created 3 years into that. So that was, if you like, the kind of genesis of what we were doing. And then things got better. And then 2008-9 hit, and we had the same cycle. And then we had the same cycle around the pandemic, albeit much shorter in terms of duration. So I think we've been there quite a few times in terms of how you pivot. And that pivot it has to be super fast around what are you going to focus on in terms of value proposition, audience, all of those kind of things. And then crucially, it's about getting the team up and running on that message. Because if you can tell everybody internally we're going to change what we're doing, but if you don't start making that happen, then that becomes a very real challenge. So yeah, I think I'm lucky in the sense that I've been there a few times. I would say that this is the first time that we're doing these kinds of changes in what is now a much more remote world. Like pandemic forced it to be remote to a degree. We're now in a world where the new normal is a bit more remote as well, quite a bit more remote. So I think that will change some of the dynamics as well. Some of the tactics that you used for outreach and so on pre-pandemic or pre-remote working don't work. So you're going to have to change all of that up as well.
Exactly. Consistent testing. Question 3. What do you think? I mean, obviously, I know you've been software and technology for the last 20 years, and I can imagine that landscape's changed a lot. So, what do you think is the most important factor for success in B2B sales over the next year, and then looking towards the next 5 years?
So I think for the next year, it's got to be adapting the message in the way that I was just describing, which is, you've got to pivot to a more cost-centered, ROI type-centered engagement. But I think the longer trend will be the kind of the steady realization, I suppose, that people are not going to respond to just personalization. You're going to have to bring more context, more relevance to what you're doing. And that comes from research and understanding. I think the biggest thing that will affect sales over the next 10 years, that I'm not kind of the maker of this idea, but is AI is going to have a huge bearing, because it will allow you to aggregate information much, much more quickly and process that information into insights and challenging hypotheses that you can take to customers. So the first people to harness that properly, I think, will have a huge advantage. And so that's how do you use AI to do some of the things that a human being would otherwise be doing, which is inferring messages from information they're gathering. So I'm looking at your website. I can see that your financial performance is declining. Looks like it's declining in these particular regions. We have a capability that can help you improve it in those regions. here's how we can help. And the more that you can automate that process, but still have it super relevant, is where I think things will go over the next 5-10 years.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Question 4. Sales is a emotional career. Lots of ups and downs. I mean, even in the short term, especially now. But I can imagine you've had a lot of ups and downs, like we just spoke about, from those peaks and troughs of just macroeconomic environments. What's been the toughest moment in your sales career? How have you dealt with it? And what advice would you give to people looking at your career, looking at your role with aspirations to do something similar? What advice would you give them? Not necessarily to avoid those moments, but just a general advice.
So again, I found it really hard to look past kind of April, May 2020. Honestly, that was the toughest moment without question, because everything hit all at once. So you had the inability to talk to customers, you had all of their meltdowns that they were having, decisions around, do you furlough people, do you not furlough people, what do we do with our team, do we stay in the market, what do we change the message to? And all of that had to happen really, really fast. So I think unquestionably that from a sales leadership standpoint, that was definitely the toughest time, the least sleep, the most stress at home and all the rest of it, because everything else was kicking off. And I also do a bit of kind of support work for the ambulance service. So I was doing all of that and kind of exposing myself in no PPE and all that kind of stuff as well. So it was a particularly tough time. But I think if I was to look at it through a pure sales lens, it's those big deals that you've lost over the years. And I won't name check who it was, but it's the pursuits where you thought that because the individuals liked you and were buying into what you were saying, that was going to be good enough. And so it's the blind spot that we all hit at various points of not realizing that the buying center is a whole lot bigger than you've realized, and allowing your champion or your coach to control that buying center rather than finding a way to get stuck in yourself and being prepared to walk away in order to get that access or to spend your time somewhere else. So, and again, there've been a few instances of that really stick with you. And the way that my advice, my guidance around that is we've put really strong qualification processes around that to try and educate principally. It's not a kind of micromanagement. It's allow the salespeople to use a qualification scorecard for themselves that basically distills all the best learnings that we've had over many years and says, well, have you done all these things? Because if you haven't, you're exposed. And you'll never get to 100% on this scorecard. It's not possible. When you get to 70, 80%, you can start to breathe a little bit. And usually the customer awards at about 50 or 60% through the scorecard. So you feel like you've won at that point, and it's helping people realize that you haven't really won at that point. There's a lot of things that will go wrong. So, yeah.
And I guess replicating that process to make it incredibly structured and making sure that you're just not missing those points, because it's easy as salespeople, right? That you miss things, especially in calls. So yeah, no, I'm not surprised. Fifth question, fifth and final question. This question was submitted by Clip Simon. He is at Carabiner Group. Now he asks you, David, how do you get your entire first team or executive team to take ownership of the forecast number for the next year?
That's a really great question. I think to break the question down a bit, so ownership of the number that individuals have to deliver is one element, and I think the reason that Cliff's asked the question he has is because that's a different question. I think it's about helping people understand that the team they're on versus the team they lead. So they might own a part of that number and they totally own that number, but I think there's no simple answer to how do you get them. Cliff's answer is probably you need a single source of the truth and you need to be able to see that, and I think that is 100% correct. But I think it's also a question of leadership. How do you get the team together on a regular basis, looking at that number and looking at, well, where are we overperforming or underperforming against the kind of indicators of that number, and what are we going to do about it? And in my experience, that's not, like in all teams, it's not a question of everybody pointing the finger at where it looks weakest. It's going, well, what can we do collectively as a team to get to this overall number. And that might mean 2 or 3 people having to overperform by 20% in order to make up for where we thought there was going to be performance and there isn't. So that's a very rambling answer, but I think it's a combination of how do you get to the single source of the truth? Is everybody connected to the same set of numbers? Because if you don't have that, you're nowhere. And then a degree of individual accountability, and then moving everybody to a collective accountability. So we've done a lot of work with there's a series of books by a guy called Patrick Lencioni, which is all about teams and team structure and understanding some of the dysfunctions that can exist within a team. And one of the biggest fundamentals is how do you get everybody to recognize which team they're actually on, and not the team they lead is not the same team that they play on. And if you take sporting analogies, I don't know, rugby or football, you've got a defensive team, an offensive team, a goalkeeper, whatever it might be. Those are teams, and they have coaches, and they have all the rest of it sitting around that. But at the end of the day, you win games by scoring more than you let in. And that's a collective team effort. So individually, if you optimize for each part of the process, you would hope that gets you to the overall, but it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you have to compromise each of the individual bits to get an overall performance gain.
Fantastic. David.
Yes, rambling, hopefully made some sense.
No, it's made perfect sense. Fantastic answer. That's all the questions that I have today. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem.
If any of you guys listening want any more information about David, Clarify, or any of the topics that we discussed, including the foundation, as well as any other resources that David feels you might want to see, we'll leave all of these links and some resources down in the description below. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with, David, like a passing final word?
No, I say no and then immediately start thinking of something. No, I think right now, it's going to be tough on our sales teams. They're going to be potentially a bit lost. They're going to have a lot of people saying no, more people saying no than they have before, and so a big part of this job is kind of wrapping your arms around people and going, look, it's okay that we're going to be in a bit of a flux scenario for a little while. But everybody still, if we're able to align the message and so on, there are still plenty of people out there who have the problems that we can solve, and they might just not know it. And we have to help educate, challenge, get people thinking differently is a big part of this job.
Fantastic. David, thanks so much for joining us. And all the audience listening, we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Freddie.